Okay. Me? Or you're looking for the person who's next? Marjorie? It's a fun moment. Sit next. Is everybody okay? Everybody's happy? If we could ask everybody to take their seats, please. Hey, good. How are you? Nice to see you. All right, let's get underway. And thank you for coming back after the cool guy in the room left. Oh, sorry. Hey, welcome back. Welcome back. We also have Brigadier General Andrew Downs here, the Surgeon General. So more cool people are arriving, which is very awesome. So let's continue. That was a really good start, I thought. Do you guys agree? Like, talk about compelling stories and compelling storytellers. Really impressive. One of the really hard parts of the healing process, as we heard from them earlier this morning, is the isolation and loneliness of the recovery. Wounded soldiers are literally yanked out of theater and the comradeship of military service into a much more isolated lives, especially initially. And, as time goes on, many of them also self-isolate, which can complicate their physical and their emotional recovery. So the Psych Armor Institute recruits nationally recognized subject matter experts to try to create and deliver online courses about issues that are relevant to the military and veteran communities to reach those who may not be ready for some of the help that may be available to them person to person. So this is an interesting initiative, and it's in that space. So please join me in welcoming Marjorie Morrison, the founder and CEO of the Psych Armor Institute. And Marjorie's going to be shedding light on the invisible wounds of war. And she's also going to showcase one of the online courses so that we can get more familiar with it. Marjorie.
I feel a lot better now that Prince Harry's not there and I don't have to just kind of stare at him. Actually, I'm a little disappointed, but that's okay. Thank you very much, Kevin. I appreciate that that introduction. I'm so grateful to my friends from True Patriot Love and Bronwyn, who I got the opportunity to really get to know and bond with last fall in Australia, and actually seeing a lot of our friends from Australia all together again. So it's really great. Thanks for bringing so many leaders and organizations together for today's symposium. It's so important and so special. The humble and courageous military families like the Fisher House, Mason and Ellie, who we just heard from, and millions of others like them throughout the world are the reason I'm here today. When these brave men and women come back from war, back to the families that served with them, and we cannot forget, as we learned earlier, our families are serving too. They're faced with a handful of new challenges. both in their new civilian communities and in their new workplace. It's here where we begin to see the biggest divide, the gulf between the military and civilian culture. These are two very, very different worlds with two very different experiences. Something I discovered firsthand when I found myself conducting mandatory counseling to over 500 drill instructors at the Marine Corps. And then later I worked with families at Camp Pendleton. In the US, we have, which I think is very similar to most countries, we have less than 1% of our country serving and about 10% military connected, which leaves 90% of us unaffiliated. I was one of those 90%. I had no experience, no military family experience, no military friends growing up, and had no clue what I didn't know. My first experience working with active duty military was as a civilian psychotherapist at Marine Corps Recruit Depot boot camp. So I was there my first week on the job, not a single Marine came in to see me, and I thought there's gotta be a way that I can reach this population. After all, it was in about 2008, and in order to be a drill instructor, which was the main population I was supposed to work with, you had to have multiple deployments. So it was an at-risk population, and started kind of poking around the leadership, and the 2nd Battalion XO said to me, hey, I have a really good idea. Why don't we do some mandatory group counseling with the drill instructors? And I had never worked with a service member before, right? And I thought, what do I need to know? So I said, that's awesome, that's great. So as I was walking back to my office, he called me and he said, great news, I talked to the CO, the hats will be ready for you at 1400, but we're just gonna do a pilot with the green belts. And I hung up the phone and I was like, I have no idea what he's talking about. I didn't know any of that, but I quickly had to sort of like figure it out, and I show up, which was 2 hours later, no time to do any research or learn anything. I show up and I walk into the battalion, and I'm excited. I'm so stupid that I didn't even know to be nervous. I'm excited. I walk in at 1400. I'm on time, by the way, but everyone's already there because in the military, if you're on time, you're late, but I didn't know that. And I walked in and everybody stood up, and that made me really nervous because I didn't know who was behind me, but it actually turned out that they were so respectful. They were standing up for me. And and for those of you who you got to do a little visual here of drill instructors, right? The scariest of the scary. I now found myself in a room with 30 of them, big old hats, and I had sheer panic over me. And so in the moment of like, holy crap, I don't know what I should do, I said, well, why don't we just all like put our seats in a circle? And so while they were moving, I quickly thought to myself, okay, I have an idea. Why don't we go around the room and all say what our name is and where we're from? Like, it's a simple exercise, icebreaker, right? I might meet some of you outside and say, where are you from? It's like a common thing. So the first drill instructor gets up and he says, I'm Staff Sergeant Jones, and I don't understand what you mean, where am I from? Like, what company am I with? What was my last duty station? What was my last deployment? Where I went to high school? And I, in that moment, knew how much I didn't know. We have, by the way, I did stay there for a year, and we did put every drill instructor through mandatory counseling, so it worked, but it was a lot of learning on my part. In the US, we have over 40,000 nonprofits that support veterans, but I couldn't find a single place that had information for people like me, people that needed to know information and where we could find them. I needed quick, digestible, quality knowledge, and scouring the internet was not helpful. I imagined like an online library where I could go and just go get quality content when I needed it. My later work at Camp Pendleton allowed me to get to know the military families, many whom were selfless caregivers that found themselves in tough times with limited knowledge to guide them through. I also saw firsthand how these military families and caregivers had a unique set of skills and experiences, and we heard it so beautifully this morning. Experiences that those of us that didn't serve like myself simply don't understand. But those experiences have proven to be so valuable in schools, universities, and a society as a whole. And that message is something that's not heard enough, and we really have to share it. One of the best parts about being here in Invictus Games is that we get to see in real time the military-civilian divide becoming less and less pronounced. This event brings together people from so many different cultures, experiences, and backgrounds, and fosters a greater understanding between these two groups. It's this demonstration and these shared values that gives me hope, and what drove me to start Psych Armor. which is now a free online resource that provides evidence-based trainings for anyone who works with, lives with, and cares for veterans. We have over 150 free, I say free because nobody believes me, but like all of you have taken our courses know it's free. We don't ever go back to our learners for money. Over 150 free, highly engaging courses broken into what we call online schools. So military culture, employers, educators, caregivers, and volunteers are just a few. So much like a publishing house, we go and we find the best content that we can, and then we make it as engaging as possible. And we use animation and gamification and embed videos. To date, we've trained over 250,000 people. We're averaging about 3,000 learners a day. And I actually, in this speech, have that 87% of our learners come back for a second course. And I found out yesterday on our latest metrics that it's actually 91% come back for a second course. Thank you, and I think it just goes to show you how much thirst there is for knowledge. In the veteran space, we often talk about the military-civilian divide. However, the civilian side, A, they don't know that they're civilians, and B, they don't know that such a divide exists. So what can we do? What can we do to close it? I feel like so many times people don't know, like myself, that they need military cultural competency until they're in a situation where they need the knowledge. But imagine the difference we could make if people were prepared to engage, celebrate, understand, and support veterans in advance. That's where we all come in. You've heard the statistics. According to the VA, somewhere between 11 and 30% of veterans from all eras experience a mental health disorder in their lifetime. Invisible wounds like PTSD, traumatic brain injury, depression, and substance use disorder can be caused from non-combat and combat military experience. Invisible wounds are just as real and just as important as physical wounds. But I want to be clear. Suffering any injury from military service does not mean that a veteran is broken or incapable. Veterans are so resilient. They are strong, evidenced by our athletes here at Invictus, and they deserve our encouragement and support. We must acknowledge that just as a veteran was brave to serve, he or she is also brave to recognize the symptoms and seek treatment. Mason, you, wherever you are, you did a great job illustrating that for us earlier. For all invisible wounds, their symptoms and impairments, they present differently from person to person. But the important thing to know is that treatment works, there's hope, and support is available. Education is the very first step to being able to support someone with invisible wounds. That's why at Psych Armor we've devoted a lot of time on invisible wounds of war. And you'll find free courses on these topics across all of our different schools. This trailer of one of our courses is called Invisible Wounds of War at Home, and I'm going to show you just a small portion of it.
Welcome to Invisible Wounds of War at Home. My name is Heidi Kraft. I'm a former Navy clinical psychologist. But here's the thing, and there's really no two ways around this. What we've learned over the last many, many years at war, what we are understanding in a new way is the complexity of those wounds that are not visible to the human eye. In fact, we have a large number of today's combat veterans, as well as those from wars that came before, who are injured, who have suffered an insult to either their brains or their hearts or their souls in a way that has damaged them, has caused a real and significant injury. The purpose of this presentation is for family members of those veterans. So those of you taking this, you know, you're living it. You see it every day. And you know that even though your veteran may look perfect to somebody walking down the street, you are acutely aware that your veteran is suffering and has been injured. When we talk about the invisible injuries of combat, we are typically talking about 4 distinct kinds of wounds, diagnoses, if you will, that people are not able to see, but that our combat veterans might be struggling with. It's important to understand that even though each of these wounds exists on its own as a separate diagnosis with separate symptoms and separate kinds of functional impairment that they cause, they're also very complicated because many times there's a crossover and people suffer from more than one. So when we're talking about the invisible injuries of combat, we're typically talking about post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, traumatic brain injury, or TBI, substance use disorder, or depression.
That's a sample of one of our courses. As Dr. Heidi Kraft says in that video, these invisible wounds of war are complex. They represent an assault not only to the brain, but to the heart, the family, and even the soul. This course emphasizes the importance of valuable skills for family members, including not to preach, lecture, or threaten a veteran or anyone else living with an invisible wound. Invisible wounds involve chemical and/or physical changes to the brain. They aren't a choice, but they are treatable and can become manageable conditions. Certain symptoms of traumatic brain injury, like anger, memory problems, and difficulty concentrating, also aren't a reflection of the veteran or how he or she feels about you. The important thing is to acknowledge how painful it is, how stressful it can be, and to watch the changes. I mean, it's so stressful to watch the changes. And I mean, we've met so many people over time, and I know so many of you know, but it is hard to watch someone that you care about. So often, these invisible wounds are injuries that we shy away from talking about. But by acknowledging a veteran's feelings, experiencing, and truly listening, I always say that, like, we don't have to know the answers, we just have to listen. You know, if you think about who you like to spend the most time with, it's usually people who listen to us and don't judge. But if we can just sit there and be there for people and listen, we can perhaps start the most important conversations of all, the conversations about saving lives and prevent suffering. It's so important for us to take this into our everyday life. That's why I'm so inspired by the work of Prince Harry, as I know so many of us in this room are, who's been initiating these type of conversations every day. We all owe him a debt of gratitude for his incredible work in bringing the Invictus Games from just an idea to a prominent international sporting event, drawing many of the world's leaders and 550 competitors, which is crazy to think about, from 17 nations. This gives all of us here this week a rally point to celebrate and understand those who have sacrificed so much to reach the world and the truth about invisible wounds. Our veterans and our military families and caregivers deserve to return home to a country that is ready to embrace and serve those that served. I'm proud to be among the likes of so many of my good friends here today, like Colonel Miguel Howe and the whole team at the George W. Bush Institute, Barbara Van Dalen and Give an Hour, Terry Tennillian for her groundbreaking research at RAND, and so many others, like Sharon Squire, who's doing the great Ombudsman program in Canada, and so many of my other favorite colleagues like Rachel Ahern, Linda Davis, Roy Brocious, Bonnie Carroll, Karen May, Mark Reedy, and all of the other ones who are working every day to make this vision a reality. Caregiving for someone with an invisible wound is very difficult. For the military families and caregivers, we urge you, give yourself permission to seek help, as well as respite, in it for you and for the one you love. My appeal to all of you today, we must bring Invictus and our experiences in Toronto home with us, back into our communities. Please take one of our free psych armor courses, share them with people you know. You might want to start with Invisible Wounds of War overview. Talk about your experiences here. Talk about the people you meet with each other, when you go home. One of the things I love so much about Invictus Games, and last year in Orlando was my first one, it brings all of us together, military and civilian, man and woman, American, Australian, and together, only by working together can we create a society that integrates military culture into everyday life. Closing the military-civilian divide is going to take a lot of work, but I have faith that we're all going to get it done. Thank you.
You know, the first time I was invited to participate. I think it was in the first True Patriot Love forum like this. It was in Washington, D.C. I remember having my eyes opened to the fact that in the United States anyway, everyone had identified the same problems in Canada, in Australia, in the UK, but in America they had innovated in a way that I thought was really profound. And I remember coming back and talking to I was working in Ottawa at the time, and talking to some of the people at our Department of National Defense saying, you know, we might have to open up the doors to these kinds of ideas from entrepreneurs, from businesses, and it might be a way to sort of solve the problem that we've all identified. Our next panel is going to explore the impact of a service member's psychology and or cognitive injuries on members of his or her family. And one of the moderators of this is somebody that I met in Washington as well. This is Barbara Van Dalen, licensed child psychologist. Her brilliant insight, as I remember, and she'll talk about it here, is just setting up some way to register as a psychologist so that you could help mentor and provide therapy to people in remote areas of the United States, because quite often, as in Canada, bases are not in major cities. So I thought that was an awesome idea, and she's going to take that to the next level. Please welcome to the stage Barbara Van Dalen and the panelists.
No, I'm going to sit here. Good morning. Oh, come on, Miguel taught you. Good morning. Thank you. So I'm Barbara Van Dalen, and I am incredibly proud to be here. I want to thank Bronwyn and Sean and True Patriot Love for inviting me. And this is my 4th symposium. I am so proud that I have been able to be part of each one of these amazing gatherings. So thank you very much for that. I'm also proudly wearing my Invictus pin because last year I was at the Invictus Games in Orlando, and I was extremely proud to be part of the United States presidential delegation for those games, and I had the opportunity to speak at the Invisible Wounds Symposium that the Bush Institute hosted. It was phenomenal, and it's very emotional for me to be here to be part of all of these different things. So I'm also very excited because I know all 3 of these people really well. And so this is going to be a great conversation, and that's what it will be, a conversation about how we look at the impact of these invisible injuries on family members. And so what I'm going to do is ask each one of them to tell you who they are briefly, and more importantly, why they are here. And I'm going to start and tell you just a little bit about who I am. More importantly, why I'm here and why I belong on this panel. So I am a clinical psychologist, and I am the president and founder of Give an Hour. And as you heard, thank you, Kevin, where are you very much for that those lovely words about the work we do. We provide free mental health care to those who serve and their families, caregivers, families of the fallen. In the United States, so far, we've given $23 million worth of free care by harnessing civilian mental health professionals, asking them to, that's right, give an hour a week of your time and be available to serve someone who is in need. The other thing that we do, and many of the organizations that partner with us are in the room, our focus is also on changing the culture of mental health. It began the focus in the US, but it's now expanded, and we're already partnering with other nations focusing on that culture work. And I was extremely proud to work with First Lady Michelle Obama and Rory Brocious, who's with us now today, was the Deputy Director of Joining Forces, the First Lady and Dr. Biden's initiative. And through that work, we began to tell this story about the importance of changing the culture for everyone, because we can't expect our service members and their families to say, excuse me, I have post-traumatic stress, I need a little help over here, when we, as a broader culture, don't do that. So that's that work. So why am I here? All of those reasons, but there's really a very personal part of this for me. Okay, now let's see if it's funny. I knew it was like, okay, I won't cry about this, but I might. My father served in World War II. He was a first-generation American, and he lied about his age to join the Navy after Pearl Harbor, like many men of his generation did. And he came home After the war, he had been injured. He saw many things that were horrible and painful and brutal. And my father was an amazing man. He took care of my three older brothers and myself. After I was born, my mother was diagnosed with schizophrenia. And so here my dad was in rural California, 3 little boys and an infant baby girl and a psychotic wife. So my dad did what a lot of veterans do. He stepped up, he took care of us, and he was the inspiration and a huge part of everything that I have become. He also had post-traumatic stress, except for we didn't call it that. We didn't know what it was. There certainly weren't any holistic anything for that people then, men primarily back then in rural California in the 1960s. And so that too shaped my life. Our family was very fortunate in that my father was quite functional and amazing. But when it came out, it was terrifying. And it was so frightening as a little girl to watch the impact that that had. He and my 3 older brothers, all the stress that was in the family already because of my mom and trying to figure that out. And then this would erupt. But here's the amazing thing, and I hope we talk about this today. My father, I'm a psychologist. I think I got a lot of that from him. He didn't go to college, but he was a very wise man. After this explosion would happen, he would come to me and he would say, "Sister," because I was the sister, 3 older brothers, that was my nickname. And he would say, cute, huh? He would say, "Sister, I don't know what that was. I have no idea, and I am so sorry, but it wasn't you." That was probably the most significant thing that he could have done to help me as a child, later as a teen, and eventually as an adult, understand that whatever was happening in him, he recognized it was not me. Sadly, there are a lot of service members who they don't know, and they don't know how to communicate that, or they don't. That's what we're here to talk about. What are we seeing? What are some wonderful advancements? Why is this important? So that's my story, and I now will ask my members of this wonderful panel to tell you a little bit about their organization and why they're here. Sue?
Thank you. Well, I'm Sue Freeth. I'm the Chief Executive of an organisation in the UK called Combat Stress. We're 98 years old, so we've been around a long time. We are the kind of primary charity working with veterans with trauma, anxiety, depression and post-traumatic stress disorder. We have treated about 10,000 people in the last 10 years. And we have been developing a body of knowledge gained from doing that treatment and sharing that internationally and widely. And I know many of the people working in the organisation have contacts with some of you here in this audience and are very keen to mature and develop that. So that's one of the reasons why I'm here. The reason why I wanted to be part of this panel is that partners is something that increasingly is becoming vitally important to the work that we do. Veterans, many veterans who come to us feel that we aren't doing the enough work, we're not recognising the support and the needs that their partners have. And so we have started to do some work in that area, but we're very keen to learn and develop practices that are being evolved in other parts of the world too. So why are we here? I fundamentally believe it's very important that Invictus Games involves veterans with psychological injuries and that actually they share as an equal platform in this fantastic growing event, international event, and that their families also get to be part of this enormously, I think, enjoyable and rewarding community. So I don't have a kind of experience to compare with Barbara's, but so as a leader of a very important organisation, that's really why I'm here. I mean, we all have mental health personal stories, and I have some too, but they're not veteran stories, but they ring very much I think, in what Barbara said about the importance of in enabling us to understand that it's not about each other, and actually begin to get people to talk. So that's why I'm here.
Rory?
My name is Rory Brocious. I am a vice president at ScoutComms, which is a small communications, advocacy, and public interest research group in the Washington, D.C. area. As Barbara mentioned, before I joined ScoutComms, which is all focused on veterans and military family issues, I was the senior policy advisor for First Lady Michelle Obama and Dr. Jill Biden on veterans and military families. I am here today because this is an issue very near and dear to my heart. Both professionally and personally, I'm a social worker by training and ended up in the policy space quite by accident. But when I ended up there, my husband was an E4 in the United States Marine Corps, and so I was very different from most of the policy experts that were sitting around the table. But I'm also here today as the spouse of a veteran who has been in treatment for post-traumatic stress for over 3 years. And this is my community. I had the great pleasure of going to Invictus in London and in Orlando with my bosses, which was great. But I've built these amazing relationships with these athletes and their families because it feels like my family. And I think most military family members would tell you when you're around other military families, you feel at home. And when you're going through something that's so challenging, like a treatment of an invisible wound, you feel unmoored. You feel like you don't have a place or you're alone, and here you don't feel that. So I'm very excited to be here today.
Thank you. Rakesh?
Hi. Rakesh Jetley, senior psychiatrist with the Canadian Forces. It's an interesting fourth meeting for lots of us, and I just want to thank True Patriot Love for putting this on for us. A little bit about me. So I've been around for a little while, and I mean, people like Chris Linford are in the room, and we were in Rwanda together a few years ago. So someone like me, and I was just reminded of my Captain MO days in Borden by our colleague in the front. So, a couple of years ago as well. And so I sort of bring a perspective from a clinician, soldier, father, this kind of idea of somebody that's had sort of that unique experience of, this massive humanitarian thing we called Rwanda, which was, a shit show, as everybody knows. The classic peacekeeping in your knee-high socks and your khaki shorts that we did in the Golan Heights, which again, we did it in Cyprus. We did it these really, really long missions that were kind of interesting and just part of our routine and part of, for many Canadians, part of our, our identity. And then a couple of stints in Afghanistan, sort of that, pure war fighting kind of thing at the Royal 3 Hospital. And so having that kind of perspective, and then also the growth of mental health within our organization, the idea of literally nothing at all available for us when we're in Rwanda. You get off the plane, you return your kit, you go get drunk for a couple of days and carry on kind of idea, to the incredible things that we're continuing to evolve, but learning about putting things in, pre-deployment, during deployment, this kind of thing in the families. Mm-hmm. I'm on this panel because my boss told me to come here. Those of you neutral. I'm kidding. This was I think this is an interesting one because as physicians, we learn a lot in medical school, or psychology school, wherever we are, we learn. But the real learning that they don't tell us about is the learning from the patients, learning from the families. And we're too quick to talk and we don't listen. Some studies have said, the average family doctor, 7 seconds, they interrupt the patient as the patient's talking. That's unfortunately the medical model that we have. And in the mental health professionals, we actually get to sit back and talk a little bit and have that exchange. And so, a guy that I saw just a couple of weeks ago that says, I'm a really well-trained person, but I feel stupid. So I feel stupid isn't in the DSM diagnostic criteria. Like there's no pill for stupid, but he feels stupid, right? So listening to the impact of these illnesses, looking to the, not being able to take my kids to a hockey game, not being able to do these kinds of things. So you learn that, and that's kind of the art of seeing the gaps and where the health services ends and where the other stuff starts, and the other stuff is. So one of the things that we, and I'm really sort of happy as the Canadian Armed Forces, over the years, and thanks to TPL and thanks to some of these corporations, we've kind of realized that we don't have to fix this all ourselves, and it's not health services that has to fix everything, and the idea of having the government, charities, UK has done a great job, US has done, but government, charities, the philanthropy, businesses, all sort of look to see, what's the impact and how can we help, right? And I think that's the piece. And besides being told to be here, that's why. That's the other reason. That's the other reason that I'm
Well, I
here.
think those are both good reasons, frankly. So, okay, let's start with, and again, this is a conversation, so whoever wants to respond will do that, and I'll keep us moving. Let's talk about, because we throw these terms around like holistic, and this panel is really focused on holistic healing for families and why that's important, and is it happening, and what are we seeing? Because there's an assumption in that we believe that's helpful, that's important, this notion of holistic healing. So let's start there first and define so that everybody here is on the same page, and maybe even the four of us aren't on the same page, we'll find out. What do the three of you think about when you hear that? What are we trying to create for families? We heard a little bit from the folks that talked today about Invictus could over time become more holistic. That's how I heard it. What do you all think about that notion? What are we talking about holistic for families of those who have served with these injuries?
Well,
Everyone takes a scary look across.
I think first of all, I think it's focusing on the partner and children in their own. So they're not just, if you like, part of the injured person's plans. Mm-hmm. So actually thinking about almost the dual elements of that. So thinking about how they can better understand what's going on, get well informed on the kind of needs they have, and how to support them, and kind of be taken into that, but also be seen as an individual. I mean, what I find interesting is that we recognize this in other forms of healthcare. So in dementia, we wouldn't dream of supporting someone with dementia on their own. But almost if we're having to force ourselves into thinking, this family members, the children and the partners, they are important parts of this story.
In their own right,
in their
as you
own
said,
right,
yes.
in their own right. And so therefore it's their health needs, their support needs, their emotional needs, their psychological needs, any acquired psychological needs, because we're certainly discovering that some members have, and then also their opportunities to lead the lives they thought they were going to lead. So to be able to work, to have the support and the respect, and as someone said earlier, this is a long journey, and it's not the journey that either the individual thought they were going to be setting out on, but neither did the partner, and the children probably don't understand what's going on at all. So it's their only reality. So that's what I think when I think of holistic.
Right.
And I would say, there was a huge movement to do, warrior-centric care, and I think there is a place for warrior-centric care, but there is a huge place for family and community-centered care. When I think about some of the most successful recoveries I've seen in the wounded warriors I've come to know over the past 10 years, they've been in families that are supported. They've been in families where they not only are going to couples counseling with their spouse, but their spouse is seeing someone individually, and their kids are getting the support that they need. And so when I think about holistically healing, you can't do that without your community coming around you and having the same types of support. And it is a long road. Some days are going to be great, and some days are going to be terrible, and it could be tomorrow or 5 years from now. And so knowing that you have that network that you can reach out to that's also supported is really important.
Rakesh, I'm going to shift and ask you to include another piece here. You feel free to add to this, but you're in I think, a really key position to answer another question that I think, well, certainly something that I want to hear you respond to, and I think is interesting for the audience. Why do we care? Why does this matter for the health of the force?
Thank you for that, sister. But I think to add on to the first one, I think, absolutely, we put on our clinician hats, the person across from us has the disease, right? And then, so now we've done research, we did a small survey when I was in the trauma clinic in Halifax. The depression rates in the spouses was about 7%
Yes.
in the chronic PTSD sort of in our region. So absolutely, so from a clinical perspective, which is our comfort zone, let's give everybody the help they need. But I think the other stuff that when we listen, we think about role reversal within a family. We think about sort of the burnout of the spouse that's now doing everything, right? So even practical things like, the guy, right? The Army guy that can't be left alone with the children. So the spouse has to do the run to the grocery store with the 2-year-old and the 3-year-old in tow, right? So emergency babysitting, practical kinds of things to help shift, to support people in that practical way, short-term, long-term. So we need to think sort of like, I mean, I'm a clinician, that's my comfort zone, but we need to go beyond that in terms of where things can go. And the innovation can come from the community. It's not something that we need to, with our medical hat badge or within the military Veterans Affairs come up with. But the first thing is to sort of start looking at it and thinking about sort of what's the impact of this, the ripple effect of this. Now we know biological and intergenerational PTSD, we know all this, this stuff, but it's those really practical, so when we think about holistic, it's the practical stuff that I'm thinking about, right? Just, when people deploy, there's often a home unit that helps the family while the person's away. A rear party or things like that in the Navy divisional system. But when somebody's ill, they're away as well sometimes, right? So are we going to support the family in that same way? We, meaning the community at large, right? Why do we care as an organization? It is, I mean, it's almost the most obvious thing is that, a fighting force needs to be focused on what there is, right? The reason why health service is so important and why year after year, we sort of keep, we don't really cut health services very often. We might delay some spending on other things because, why soldiers fight as well is they know that if they're going to get hurt, health services is going to look after them, right? And we had, 99% survival in our Role 3 hospital if you arrived, and many of the people that we're going to see, over this next week competing have the benefit. So knowing that you're going to get the care is important. But imagine being distracted by home issues, right? So again, you could be having PTSD flashbacks that interfere, or you could be worried about, your daughter and how she's doing, this kind of idea. So from a purely selfish point of view, the military wants all that stuff tucked away, taken care of, and it's really different now with modern communication because you hear about things that are happening more than you ever did before, but in a way, in the old wars, it was a letter once a month kind of idea. But I think, from a purely selfish point of view, you want finances, you want childcare, you want all of those things taken over. Because when you go somewhere for 6 months, you want to be just focused on what's in front of you and what your objective is.
And this reminds me, Rory, if you would talk a little bit about one of the things that was a common part of the conversation during the years that Joining Forces was running and we were gathering. There's another piece of what Rakesh is saying too, which is if we don't take care of those who are affected, the ripples, what that does to recruitment, retention, all of that.
Yep. I think everyone in the audience who knows me has heard me say this a million times, so I'm going to get on my soapbox for 1 minute, which is family readiness is mission readiness, period, end of story. You do not get to give that up. You do not get to give that up. We look at a U.S. military with a huge number of recruits coming in each year that have a military connection, and if their experience of their family over the past 16 years of war is terrible, people are going to question whether they should put their name on the dotted line. And I spent 2 years working for the Marine Corps. Marjorie, I feel you on the hats coming in the room. They're scary. But 2 years as a family readiness and deployment trainer assigned to 1st Marine Division, which was forward deployed for the entire time that I was on the ground with families. And we used to say there are 3 legs on the stool for mission readiness, and it's training, it's equipment, and it's family. And if one of those legs is not supported, or God forbid it is missing, that stool is going to topple over. And we invest millions of dollars in our recruits to train them, to make them part of the finest fighting forces in the world. And if they are concerned that back home they have a child who's struggling or a spouse who's struggling with a mental health issue that can't get what they need, they're not focused on the mission at hand. And that's a scary place to be. So I really feel very passionately that these issues, as we talk about supporting the family, this is what makes us strong. This is what makes us a good fighting force. You have a soldier that goes home to a strong family, they're in a better place and they're on better footing to do their job. And I just think that is eminently important to remember.
And Sue, that follows through the veteran continuum, right? I mean, if you have veterans who their families are not taken care of, there's that then, because many, we know this, generational. My father served, as I said, my uncle served, my nephew is currently serving. This is passed on generation to generation. And so if our veterans are the only focus and their families are suffering, that affects the long-term interest in continuing that service, doesn't it?
Absolutely, and I think this is where it becomes more difficult, because I think a veteran's family may have had a close relationship to the military, but there are probably as many that haven't. Yeah. And actually, this is completely foreign area. It's not an area that some veterans really feel they can talk about, and there has to be a sort of process that enables them to do that. And at the point when they're ready, access, I think, from the work that we've been doing more recently around partners, the most difficult thing is actually providing programs that they can access. Because of all these other elements of the difficulties in their lives, there are so many other duties that they're involved in. Access is really difficult. Designing programs that actually are going to be at the right time for them with all of their responsibilities, and that they will have the confidence to feel will support them. I mean, we've talked, and there's been quite a lot of written about, I think, a sort of still a lack of confidence in treatment, although there are some very effective treatments available. But for families, they tend to, well, family partners in particular, just feel that they don't, should they be taking up the space that somebody else should be having? Is that actually going to work for our particular circumstances? If you don't have a service or any experience of service life, then it can be even more difficult. So I think we really have to get some creative work going to pick up on what the research is sort of beginning to pull together and really translate that. And it has to be, I think, translated into more general health and social care practice, because it can't be done by individual dedicated units, if you like, or programs that are within the veterans community. We've got to work with the wider health and social care organisations and system, because without that we won't be able to get everyone. And I think we should be trying to support every single partner, because this is good for everyone. It's good for the children, it's good for the family, it's good for the veteran.
So you brought up a couple of interesting points that I want to dig deeper with our other friends with us. This notion of barriers to care. So you brought up one that I think is very interesting, and we see this in our National Guard units back home, where the families may not have a lot of connection, identity, they don't identify. And also veterans, when the service member or the veteran has his challenges, the spouse, the parents may not feel like, well, I don't want to take up services. I need to focus on caring for him or her. So talk, Rory and Rakesh, about these barriers that prevent, both barriers that this family member might have, barriers in the community, because if we can build great programs, but if we can't reach them, we're out of luck.
Well, and I think this is, specific to the United States. For veteran spouses and caregivers, if you're not an official caregiver, it can be hard to find culturally competent care. It's hard to find somebody that knows what you're going through. We're also not covered by the VA. If you're not a caregiver, you're not covered by the VA services, unless you know someone who then tells you can go to a vet center. And you can go to the vet center and you can be seen at the vet center. But that brings up kind of that broader communication issue that we talk about all the time, which is, I left policy and went to communications, not just because my bosses left and my job went away, although that was one part of it, but because I felt like we could be doing it better in our community. There are so many great things out there. The folks at Bush and their Warrior Network, and Wounded Warrior Project's Warrior Care Network, and the Cohen Veterans Network, and Give an Hour, those things are out there, and it's a question of how we get that message to people who need it. Because one of the barriers is simply, there's just the Internet of Things, and I don't know where to look. And so I think for veteran families especially, it can be very hard in the United States to find what you need, but it's out there. There's so many great options for us, and we just have to get better at talking about it.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a great topic. I mean, barriers to care can be looked at in many ways, right? There's attitudinal, there's structural, I mean, in Canada, we have geographic challenges, right? And so, which is where technology is going to come in and things like this. But I think, the attitudinal thing is am I worthy, right? Am I worthy of care? My husband or my wife is the warrior. I'm just the spouse kind of idea. And so how do we shift that in the culture? Now, it's interesting because, my whole career has been PTSD, and we have worried, and we've had this discussion, that have we oversold the PTSD thing so that the people with just depression that haven't deployed, which is our number one illness, like everybody in the Western world, are they going to feel hesitant to come forward and take the spot of the warrior that got his PTSD, when he got blown up kind of idea, right? So this is kind of our shift, for those in uniform that may or may not have noticed is, where when the Surgeon General speaks, when I speak, when the Director of Mental Health speak, we say, yeah, the PTSD rate's 8, but did you see what the depression rate is? Did you see our depression rate is still higher than the depression rate in society, whether you've deployed or not, right? And so in the same way, this is the idea of, this is the kind of idea where something is morally the right thing to do and also practical. So those are nice things where we recognize the fact that, mental illness is common anyway.
Right.
And if you are mentally ill and we've put more challenges on you, then you're going to break. So the strength, so it's that practical attitudinal thing. Of course, then you need to build the resources, then you need to change so that's the structural barriers have to be dealt with as well. But I think the ultimate idea is that, everybody's sort of entitled to it. The veteran piece, I think, is interesting because what wars do, just like your dad, wars change our definition of veteran. Up until about 10 years ago, it was those old guys. It was those old guys that you see on the parade on November 11th kind of idea. But now we've got these young guys, guys and gals, that are in their 20s and 30s with young families. And so kids still need to look up to their parents. We're going to have a generational problem there. So the practical side of ensuring that the family unit, whatever it is propped up the best it can so that people can feel proud of their parents. The parents need to have purposes. We need to get them jobs. We need to find out what they're capable of doing. Back to school, all of these kinds of ideas, because otherwise we're going to have a generation of kids, millions in your country, thousands in ours, that are not going to have that normal sense of, hey, I'm proud of my parents and look what my dad does and my mom does, this kind of idea. So we need to look at and that's again the holistic kind of challenge.
Well, and the way that you bring up this wonderful point that one size doesn't fit all, both in terms of what we offer and what works for the individual. One person who might, not have had any ever mental health challenge that would have registered anything by any provider, because of what's going on now in their family and the stress they're experiencing, are overwhelmed. They start to feel maybe anxiety or depression for the first time. And what might work or be helpful to them may not be
100%.
Necessary or helpful to someone else. So that sort of stepping back and taking the bigger picture is critical on so many levels. So this seems like a really big issue to take on, to do this, but we all are doing this. So we have about 5 minutes left. I want to sort of close with, what do you see out there that is really working? I don't mean specific programs necessarily, but rather approaches, ideas, what's important, communication. Can we go a little deeper with what are we doing? Clearly the fact that we're talking about it, recognizing it, that's huge. But what else comes to mind that maybe this audience, some folks here maybe aren't aware of, so that they take that home and they go, okay, we need to build that piece or think about that piece?
I would say that we talk really well to one another in the space here. I think all of us, I'm seeing all of my Washington people right in front of me right now, who I love to see all the time. But there are a lot of people here that I don't recognize, and that's amazing. That's great. That means we're doing it right. I think we talk to each other a lot, and we all agree and we all talk about these things. When you walk into a conference, I don't think you should recognize everyone there. I just don't. We need diversity of thought and diversity of experience to really bring new knowledge to the space, because You know, it's great to have the experts agree on something. It's very, very different to be a Lance Corporal spouse at 29 Palms all alone. And so I do think that in terms of communication, and what I love about working at ScoutComms is that we just focus on veteran and military family issues and organizations that support our community, and we try and get outside the box and meet people where they are and try and get to that Lance Corporal spouse. It doesn't mean I have to talk to People magazine or pitch a television show to talk about vet centers. Get outside the box, because if we're not reaching those families, we could be providing the best services in the world, but we're not maximizing our reach. And I think we could be doing better in that space.
I think two things. One is, I think there are real signs, certainly in the UK, I think there's a sense now families are very much on the radar. They are starting to feature in the commissioning of services. So we've just had a new Veterans Intensive Service commissioned, and families are right in the middle of that, and that's fantastic. It's a shame that it's taken us until now to do that, but it's also, families are also inside the Ministry of Defence's mental health strategy again, close to a first, and actually we're beginning to see families being appreciated as they're in their own right. I think we are becoming better connected internationally. I think it's what we do with the best knowledge and the best research that comes out, and how we collectively turn that into policy and practice at a governmental level. And so I think it's about not resting on you know, the good work that's been achieved so far. To really change our public health systems, we've got to be, I think, really focused on joining the best knowledge and turning that into the best practice.
Rakesh, you get the last word on this.
Well, I mean, I think many things are going on. I mean, in a standard assessment in our clinics for PTSD, you know, as a rule, again, the members' confidentiality dictates, but routinely we bring in the spouse early on. We do this. We have psychoeducational programs. The MFRCs or family resource centers are putting more and more programs in place. You know, very deliberately, I'm lucky enough to be working with Troop Patriot Love and the disbursement of, you know, $1 million, you know, in terms of, you know, the research or programs or these kinds of things, and deliberately families is part of it. So again, you're looking at it, and one of the ways we look at this is we look at sort of, you know, what's the real impact those dollars are going to have on that community, on that broader thing. So whether it's philanthropy, whether it's government, this kind of idea, I think the recognition, you know, of the family, again, for the moral reasons and for the practical, pragmatic reasons, you know, I think we're moving. We haven't done enough. I mean, we can keep moving, but for something that wasn't on the radar at all, it's now front and center. Right? And I think we've, you know, we've got the leadership speaking about it. We've got, and it's not just, again, not just health services, but it's when you can line up, you know, government, philanthropy, business, and we're all sort of on the same page. I think that's moving towards a solution.
So I've heard a lot of really sort of key elements that I think we can all hopefully take away. You know, this notion that we have made progress, and we certainly have, that there's obviously much more to do, that families need to be part of the conversation always, at all levels of the providing the care, identifying the needs, looking broadly at one size doesn't fit all. Not only is it mental health services, but also mowing the lawn or respite or gardening or whatever. The communication piece is critical. You know, and again, I go back to my own experience. It was decades before I had even had the thought, wouldn't it have been nice if someone had worked with our family to help us understand what was going on? We didn't even have language to make sense of it. So, and we are, through Give and Hour, we work with lots of families, and that reluctance to take, receive, so anything we can do. I loved the conversation earlier about, that Ellie was talking about, her opportunity to mentor allows her to give and receive. So I think thinking creatively outside the box about how to engage. There's wonderful organizations here who work with families in that way. So I think we have much to be thankful for, and obviously much more to do. So I want to thank our panelists today. Join me in thanking them for their time, their commitment, their expertise.
Well, listening to that, I might have a small contribution here, just something that I've sort of triggered on. I mean, as we look forward to sort of new ways of adapting and creating new systems, I think there's also a need to go back and look at the systems which have been in place for a very long time sometimes, because sometimes those can be barriers to the proper health as well. I can think of one in particular in the Canadian example, which I know from a buddy of mine who is a veteran. He got out after 8 years because in Canada we're having to shrink our military because of budget cuts. And there was this very small thing that unless you had been in the military for 10 years, you couldn't get a veterans card. And so he couldn't get a veterans card, even though he'd been to war in Afghanistan. And he couldn't, show up at Shoppers Drug Mart to get the veterans discount. He didn't have a number that would allow him to access a lot of the programs. And it just seemed to be a holdover from an era where, people were in the military for life. And that went on for many, many years. And so there were all these young men who were proud of their service but weren't recognized for the country simply because somebody hadn't gone backwards and taken a look at, well, what does it take to get a veterans card? So our new Minister of Veterans Affairs is coming by this afternoon, so I may put on my journalist hat for a minute and ask, did you fix that card? One of the things we have been good at, though, I think, as a country, is that we recognized early the importance of identifying the trauma that children go through when their parents have been traumatized by PTSD or their experiences in war or suffering from depression. We were one of the first, actually, to commission research into that and shared some of that with our colleagues in Australia, Great Britain, and the United States. So that's what we're going to talk about next for our next panel before lunch. And to discuss this, I'd like to welcome to the stage, please, Dr. Alice Aiken from Dalhousie University and her panel.
Chair. We need another chair. We do need another chair. We're going to need one more chair. Do you want to just slide yours back, Heidi? We can figure this out. We need one more chair. There we go. Perfect.
Well, thanks everybody. I'm really excited to be here today and to speak to you about this panel. And I will give you a little bit of background as to why I'm here, and then I'm going to ask each of the panelists to do the same. So I am the Vice President of Research at Dalhousie University. I did serve in the Canadian Navy for 14 years. I was a ship's navigator and then a physiotherapist. I am the spouse of somebody who served in the Army for 27 years. My husband was in the Signals Corps. And in 2009, I started working on a project. I was then at Queen's University with a small group of people, and we launched what became known as the Canadian Institute for Military and Veteran Health Research. And I was the first scientific director of that institute up until the summer of 2016. And what we really recognized is there are great programs out there to support military and veterans, but what we need to ensure is that we're doing the research around the health of military and veterans and their families to ensure that the care we are giving them is what we think we are doing for them. None of us want anything less than evidence-informed care for ourselves or our loved ones, so it's very important that we focus on the research as well. Rakesh would back me on this. When we started this whole initiative, we really couldn't even talk about the families. That was in 2009. People kind of didn't want to hear it. We were beyond anyone in the Canadian military will remember DF&E, Dependents, Furniture and Effects. So that's where the family was categorized in those days. And but we really could not talk about when we were initiating this and okay, the National Defense and Veterans Affairs are going to partner with the university world to do some research, arm's length independent research. We couldn't talk about the families. And that gradually evolved, and it evolved through the persistence of incredible researchers and clinical researchers like Dr. Trish Potty, Professor Nicola Fear, Dr. Professor, and Dr. Heidi Cram, but also through the insistence of really strong family members like Marie-Andre. So I'm going to ask each of them to introduce themselves, say why they're here, and then we'll talk a little bit about the research and its direct impact and relevance.
Oh, I'm next.
You are, Marie-Andre.
So yes, my name is Marie-Andre Emelet. I'm a registered nurse, but I'm also the proud spouse of a veteran who served in the Army and suffers with post-traumatic stress disorders and also back injuries. We are the parents of 2 monsters, aged 4 and 8. They are born to drive me crazy, but we love them very, very much. We also have a wiener dog who is instrumental in my husband's therapy, although sometimes he doesn't want to acknowledge it. The reason why I'm doing this, my husband was diagnosed in 2005 after touring Afghanistan. But it was only when we were expecting our first child that I realized how we had no tools to deal with his post-traumatic stress disorder and the new baby coming. As every parent here will tell you, a new baby is something that brings a lot of stress. Add to that hypervigilance of someone who has been on tour and is always afraid that that baby will stop breathing, who is afraid of hospitals, who is afraid of doctors. That brings another level of stress to a nice and positive thing that's supposed to be happening. So when our second child came around, I thought that I had good tools to deal with all of this. We went into a situation when my husband the PTSD took over completely. I was alone on a mat leave with a newborn, a close to be psychotic husband who's 6'4" and 200-something pounds, and a 3-year-old. And I had found myself whispering to my eldest child, "Shh, Dad is sleeping." And it's when I heard him calling Papa that I realized, whoa, this is impacting him. He can't even not say his name loudly. He has to whisper his name because I'm always saying, "Papa, fais dodo." So that's where I decided that he needed treatment. I needed to utilize my nursing background into getting him into proper treatment. And I needed to also utilize my backbone as an advocate to advocate for him for good care and other veterans. And that's how I'm sitting here today and doing all of that for veterans. So,
Thank you, Marie-Andre. So Dr. Trish Potty from the Strongest Families Initiative.
So I'm the president and CEO of the Strongest Families Institute. I'm also a scientist at the IDPK Health Center and assistant professor at Dalhousie, both in Halifax. And the reason why I'm here today is, a lot to do with the research that I've done in child and youth mental health, but also my experience and research in designing new systems of care, such as the Strongest Families Institute, that removes barriers to care for families so we can get services to families as a family-centered approach when and where they need it. So I think that's it.
Great, thanks. Professor Nicola Fear from the King's Centre for Military Health Research.
Thanks, Alice.
In London.
So I'm Nicola Fear. I'm a professor of epidemiology based at King's College London, and that is London, UK. So I won't bore you with what epidemiology is, just to say that it means I love stats and numbers and data, but I promise not to go into geek speak. Promise maybe too strong a word. I'll try not to go into geek speak. But as Alice said, I'm also one of the co-directors of the King's Centre for Military Health Research. That's a multidisciplinary research unit which was formally established back in 2003 at the outset of the conflict in Iraq. And when that unit was set up, our mission was very much around what is the health and well-being of those service personnel who were deployed initially to Iraq and then our remit expanded to Afghanistan. And it's really only been in the last 7, 8 years that we've started to focus on families. And that was when we were looking at data and talking to service personnel and veterans. You know, some of them had seen and witnessed some really horrific things. They were most concerned about, well, how's my family doing? If my family are doing okay, I'm doing okay. And that really made us think, we need to be looking at the family in this. What is the impact of the service person and what they're experiencing, their mental health and well-being? How is that influencing the family and the family dynamics? So at that point we established, it's large for the UK, it's a study of over 600 military families, which accounts for over 1,000 children. And we're collecting data at multiple time points from all family members. We're happy to follow families even if they're non-traditional. If they're no longer together, we still endeavour to try and include all the viewpoints of those families. And we collect data directly from children, so we can really understand what's it like to be a child in a military family, and how does that impact on you if your father or mother has got a mental health problem. So I think my role here today is really just to talk about the research that we're doing in the UK context, and really to learn from you over here to see what you're doing, and to share research and ideas. Thanks.
Thanks, Nicola. Dr. Heidi Cram. So Alice had this great vision around SIMVR, and then I've recently, since she went to Dalhousie, we lost her to Dalhousie. So I've been the co-scientific director since August last year, but I'm at my core military and veteran family health researcher. And so Alice saw an opportunity for me to really look at my clinical work with children's mental health. I had worked in occupational therapy, child mental health services for many years before I went back and did my research training. And we live in Kingston, where we've got a pretty significant military population. And there was no research that could help me understand why I was seeing a disproportionately high representation of military kids in children's mental health services. So there was nothing for me to go by as a clinician. So when I started my faculty position, I've really been able to just focus on the military and veteran family. And for the past few years, I've been looking at the experience of kids growing up in military families and trying to understand, as Nicola mentioned, the perspective of the children themselves, which isn't represented in our research internationally very much, as well as the impact and experience of kids growing up, especially in the context of trauma.
Great, yeah. And I think, how I'd like to start is just sort of to ask Heidi, Nicola, and Trish, what are the current, the most current research, what are we seeing now, what's out there in the literature? And I'll start with a small example from one of my own research teams. We do epidemiological data with the Health Utilization Database here in Ontario, and I won't get into a big lesson about epidemiology either because I don't understand it. I'm the health policy researcher on the other end. But what we were presenting at one of the SIMVR conferences that happen every year, that's happening Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday this week. And just in describing the data we found, and we did find in Ontario the out-of-province military family data. So the spouses and children who come from out of province because they have to get a health card. Thanks to General Natinchuk, who I saw here, they don't have an interprovincial wait to get a health card. And so we had this data. And we just popped up one slide of very preliminary data in this presentation saying military children under the age of 7 were significantly less likely to see a pediatrician than age-matched counterparts. And children of military families between the ages of 7 and 14 were significantly more likely to visit their family physician for a mental health reason. Now, epidemiology always tells you what, not why, but we had just had that up on one slide, and the fallout from it was incredible. And I know I see Russ Mann in the back, and there were people there who were just, this data had never been heard before. And I think it was so resounding around the room. We really started to get attention around military family research. So Heidi, I'll start with you. So what's some of the current research that we're seeing around military families?
I think that we're now able to understand some of the health system access issues so that we can compare the pathways to service for military families in relation to civilian counterparts. So we can see that there are differences in how military families are able to access care, especially around mental health services. So that's definitely new, and that tells us that there are issues that need further work to understand why, as to what barriers and facilitators are in place. We're also doing a lot of work that is trying to unpack the complexity of trauma within family systems. So it's not a clear pathway where one person in a family has trauma and then it just flows directly down. It's not a contagious kind of aspect. It's really trying to understand all the different ways in which the spouse might be affected, and whether or not the spouse can be a mitigator or a moderator. So whether someone can help with the recovery, or whether or not the family system isn't able to accommodate. So there's this reciprocity. So it's not just that the family system is impacted, but the family system also impacts. And we've heard that on other panels today as well from the program policy, is that the family has an immediate role in providing support to the recovery itself, even though they themselves may have their own issues.
Great. And Nicola, what about from the UK perspective?
So if I can just perhaps talk about a couple of the key results that's coming out from our large cohort study of military families. So we were interested in if your father has PTSD, how does that impact on a children's social and emotional well-being? And we found that those children whose father has PTSD, they're more likely to have symptoms of hyperactivity and pro-social difficulties. And that's things like they're unkind to other children, they have difficulty sharing, those kind of behaviours. So we were looking at children from the age of 3 right through to the age of 18, and we all know, if we've got children or know of children, that a 3-year-old is very different from a 11-year-old, is very different from a 16-year-old. So we were able, because of the size of our data, we were able to dig a little bit deeper and to see, well, are there any differences by how old you are as a child? And also, do girls and boys differ? And what we found is that the effects of father's PTSD were most evident in those younger children, so particularly those under the age of 11, and also in boys. We've also been able to look at how families function from our data. And again, we were able to show that those families where the father has PTSD, they're the ones that actually don't function so well. And that's around things like miscommunication or no communication, no expressing of emotions, and also not kind of sharing in activities. So very much kind of the family is all of these different components. And the other thing which kind of taps into what Heidi was talking about is that when we interviewed these family members to get some more detailed information from them, a lot of them said, I don't know where to go to get help. And, is there going to be a stigma if I have to go and seek help and I have to say my husband or my loved one who's in the military has a mental health problem? How is that going to impact on them and their service career? So I think there are still sort of some major issues there that we need to think about how we make people more aware of what's available out there, but also how we break down those barriers.
Great, thank you. And I'm going to ask Trish to talk a little bit about Strongest Families. It is probably one of the best mental health care programs for children around, and it's entirely evidence informed, and we're just thrilled that they've turned their attention to military children. So I'll ask Trish to talk a little bit about that.
So to just lead off of some of the bidirectional relationships that we see between the effects and the impacts that a family can have if a military member is suffering from an injury, whether it's psychological or physical, and the impacts that can have on a marital relationship, and the exhaustion of a caregiver, how that impacts on children. And we know that children and youth are very sensitive to changes and influences within their environment. And those changes and symptoms are manifested in what we see very commonly in increased disruptive behavior problems, increased anxiety. And as those symptoms exacerbate over time, the children become more impaired functionally, peer relationships, as we talked about, academic progress. And when those problems escalate, it then we know that completely impacts the parents and then the cohesiveness and the family functioning of that family unit. And so that cycle, if we don't break that cycle, there's going to be really quite significant downstream effects and effects on that family unit. So Strongest Families was designed to break those cycles. And we are based on best science. We are addressing those particular problem areas that I mentioned to you, because if we can address those problem areas, imagine the impact that it's going to have on the parents. So what we've seen with our evidence-based programming, and because we're delivering it from a distance, we're removing barriers such as geographical barriers. It doesn't matter where in the world our families reside. There can be a parent that's deployed and a parent in British Columbia, and from our office in Halifax, we can help those families learn skills, evidence-based skills and strategies that they will adapt to overcome the problems that they face. Stigma is virtually eliminated. And what we're seeing in our outcomes is the impact on parental stress and mood, and significant improvements in family functioning overall, not to mention the children and the youth. We have better than an 85% impact on overcoming their presenting problems with its disruptive behavior issues, social impairment, or anxiety.
That's wonderful. Thanks, Trish. So, Marie-Andre, I know you're a clinician. You're oriented towards the evidence, but from the family perspective, how is the research and the impact that the research has affecting the families?
Well, by our experience, I had to utilize research in order to get my kids the proper support, basically. And I know today, with even at 8 years old and 4 years old, that our children are basically not affected by this. My husband actually participated in the Invictus Games last year and took the 2 kids with us. And they were able to see what resiliency and how you can be a superhero even if you're missing a leg, how you can achieve your goals even if you have PTSD, how to become a service human. My 8-year-old, my husband's very, very afraid of flying, and our 8-year-old just decided to hold his hand, and he asked what was service dog for. And then when I explained to him in words that an 8-year-old, 7-year-old can actually understand, he just made the analogy and said, "So Mom, I'm a service human, then if I'm helping that." So he does think that he's that's really sweet. He does think that he's the service human of his father, and little to no repercussion. There's also, communication is a big thing. Every year email the teacher and say, if you note anything that could be out of normal, please let me know. We have access to support that we can actually put in place for our children. You have to go ahead of the game, basically, and not wait until things happen. You were talking about hyperactivity. I have 2 boys, and I started to have gray hair already. They are very, very active, and it's very hard to channel that when you have someone where you have to limit stress around. Little boys are little boys. They want to climb on walls and on paint. They want to be Superman and Spider-Man. So we've utilized things such as white noise, such as karate, such as other tools that my husband could actually sleep until noon because he could catch up, and the kids could actually break everything in the house and not waking up dad. So these are tools that we've put in place that, research really helped us making sure that our kids were actually be able to be kids and not all the time a service human.
Yeah, that's great. I just part of being the privilege of being a researcher is at some point you start to recognize not only what you know, but what you don't know. And so I'd just like to ask both Heidi and Nicola, what's next? What don't we know? Where do we need to go?
I think one of the points I made was about children. We use this word children, but they're also different across that age spectrum, and I think we need to understand more about the needs at different ages and how best then to intervene and to support those children. And I think for me, and as a researcher, I love a bad news story. It's we're always looking for the the risk factors, the bad outcomes. But hearing today the real positive stories, there's a lot we can learn from that. And I think, we can turn our research around and look at, what makes families succeed, even, despite the adversity that is thrown at them. And what can we then take from those families that we can then apply to other families who perhaps aren't doing so well, to help them so that they can also succeed. So I would say for me, I think looking more at the positive outcomes and how we can develop those to help others.
Great. Heidi.
And so the concept of resiliency, what we all want to see, we've talked about this a lot over the past couple of years, but resiliency is a term that we hear so often in relation to military families, and so often we see the resilience and the strength. And I guess we all want to understand how to foster and cultivate the opportunities to experience resiliency. I'm concerned that sometimes when we overuse that as a goal or as a state of the norm for military families, we risk the reality that for every one of us, we can be resilient until we're not. And so for any one of us, we are vulnerable to enough factors coming at us in a short period of time, or enough accumulation or additive things. You can all think of times in your lives when there's enough come at you that you think, I'm going to break. And it doesn't matter how strong you are before that happens. What we do with that, when we say military families are resilient, is that those who are experiencing those faltering moments, who are really truly struggling, may not feel open to seeking help. So that would be my concern. But we really do need to be able to understand how to identify those most vulnerable and most at risk, and ensure that we can better understand how to create that opportunity for resiliency for more kids and families.
And Trish, what about from the clinical research perspective in terms of mental health? What do we still need to learn? Where do we need to go?
I think for me, some of the priorities that we're looking at together and the work at the Institute, we've really tried to hone in on this notion of the family-centered care. And we, working closely with military partners and our military families and getting advice from them, we've strengthened what we now have a military division, because I really feel strongly when I heard the words of some of the previous panelists, there's a couple of important themes that are coming out. Every injury, whether it's psychological or physical, is different for each person, which means it's different for each family. It is so critical that we are going to do two things, and that would be making sure that the education is there from a cultural competency perspective. Mm-hmm. All of my staff, before they are given a military family to provide counseling to, go through a specific training so that we can make sure that they're sensitive and to the military challenges that are faced and some of the issues that surround that family. But also we teach them to customize the care. Strongest Families is very much about customizing care to meet the family's needs, because every family unit is different. And we're going to miss the mark if we don't customize our care to meet those individual families' needs. And provide that wraparound holistic approach. And I think if we can come together and work collaboratively to find ways to do that, then we're going to break the cycle we're just talking about, and it's going to lead to a better improvement for military members and veterans as they're on the road to recovery.
Great, thanks. And I'm going to
put Marie Andre on the spot a little bit, give her the last word, and just sort of say, if you were to blue sky, what would you like to know for your family? What would you like research to tell you for your family?
You do put me on the spot.
You knew I was gonna.
Research. Well, that having an injury is not the end of the world, and you can overcome that. I would like to see positive outcomes out of research. Who did it work? We can actually see where are the problems with research, but what did work also, right? So and as a family, I always like to see what with other people, what worked for you, and then you try to mimic that and use that to your family and see if it's going to work. So I think research has to gear like that too. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. And I just want to end by saying, first of all, thanks to True Patriot Love for inviting me to chair this panel of 4 extraordinarily brilliant women who are truly making a difference in the lives of military families. So thank you to all of you for being here today, for the work you do, for the passion you bring to it, and to True Patriot Love for recognizing them for the work they do. So.
All right, we're going to be this afternoon another fascinating panel coming up. Different kind of research, the technological research to help injured soldiers try to gain some ability back. Captain Trevor Green will be here. The Minister of Veterans Affairs. Lots to come up, but it is lunchtime, so set your clocks for 1 o'clock to return to the room if you don't mind. Thanks so much.